Welcome, everybody, and thanks for being part of the year-long celebration for Women's Way's 50th anniversary. Today, we want to reflect on how Women's Way has had a profound impact on the Philadelphia region and what's needed to tackle some of today's challenges and continue the fight for gender equity. We want to celebrate, but also analyze some of the lessons that we can learn. I'm Lynn Marks. I'm going to serve as moderator. I was on the Women's Way board in the early 80s. And at that time, I was the executive director of Women Organized Against Rape. Today, it's called WAR, Philadelphia Center Against Sexual Violence. And I know many of you could well serve as moderator or panelist. We hope this discussion, though, will make all of us think about lessons that we've learned from Women's Way's history and how to build on them and carry this work forward. So one reason that this discussion is so timely and important, and I know I don't have to tell you, is that the government has been rolling back rights hard won. And so we think it appropriate and relevant to hear from and learn from some of the folks who were involved in the early, yes, revolutionary work of Women's Way, and to see if they can help us to learn what went on and to help us move forward. The questions can be submitted in the Q&A box. Those of you who have been on Zoom a lot know the Q&A box is different from the chat box. So we will try and get to as many questions as possible later in the program in the Q&A box. The chat's also enabled, and we encourage you to write your thoughts during this session to create a safer space for all of us to engage in an honest and open discussion. We ask you to abide by the session norms that are listed in the chat box. So Women's Way is going to record this session and make it available to you and people who couldn't attend, and it's going to be on the website. Okay, let's get started. We have a great panel today, and we're going to start with brief introductions from each of them, and they're going to talk about their affiliation with Women's Way. So we're going to start with you, Beverly Harper.
Thanks, Lynn, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Beverly Harper, founder and president of Portfolio Associates, a market research, communications, and civic engagement company that I started in 1969. Quick addition, that was 57 years ago. I was recruited to join the first Women's Way board by Ernesta Ballard. My company provided services to women in transition, and I got to know Linda Resnick, Jennifer Fleming, Allison Schwartz, Mary Ellen Rosanella, and the other smart, dedicated, compassionate young women who founded Women's Way. From the 1970s through the 2000s, I chaired the boards of Philadanco, the Painted Bride, the Enterprise Center, and was a board member of the not yet built Kimmel Center. As a board member, I developed and led the Cultural Diversity Initiative of the Philadelphia Orchestra. That's where I met and mentored Myra Brown, a former Women's Way board chair. I look forward to this discussion.
Thank you, Beverly. Graham Finney, can you tell us about yourself and your affiliation with Women's Way?
I'm a proud founding member of the board that first met at Ernesta's house. I was the only guy there. Ever since, and before that too, I've spent my career working with NGOs of all kinds, getting started. Women's Way was one of them, and it still plays this very vital role. And some of you are involved in this today and were involved back then.
Thank you. Letty Thall.
Well, it's wonderful to be here. And as I've thought about this, I've been fighting misogyny my entire life. I'm one of the founders of Women's Way because I was the leader of Women Organized Against Rape at the time, which was the first above-ground rape crisis center in the United States. I was also on the board of CHOICE. The acronym stands for Concern for Health Options, Information, Education, and Counseling. It grew out of the clergy consultation service, where I had participated in counseling women who needed abortions before the Roe versus Wade 1972 Supreme Court decision that removed abortion restrictions for most of us who were wealthy enough to be able to pay for them. And CHOICE's executive director, Winnie Schofer, called me one day to talk about a potential grant from the William Penn Foundation, that if we could form a coalition of women's groups to work together on fundraising. So as I've prepared for this discussion, I realized that our memories can be very selective, and we could all write a revisionist form of our own history. But I want you all to know that I'm talking from 1975 to about 1980. I had been the director from 75 to 77 of WAR, and then I was on the Women's Way board as the representative of the CHOICE board. So if you all have different memories, please let us know, because we only are going to learn from putting all of our memories together.
Well, that's great. Well, most of us are old timers, but Diane Cornman-Levy is the new kid on the block. So why don't you introduce yourself?
Wow, 65 years old. I've called a new kid on the block. It's so great to be amongst the three of you who built the foundation upon which this organization still stands strong. I'm Diane Cornman-Levy. My pronouns are she, her. And I am the Chief Disruptor / Executive Director of Women's Way. This is my 10th year at Women's Way. It's hard to believe. But the year before I came to Women's Way, I ran for state representative in the 168 district, which is in Delaware County. And I thought, this is going to be the year of the women. And of course, I lost along with many other women, but it led me to this position of being the Executive Director of Women's Way in January 2017. And prior to running for office, I've been doing social justice work for over 35 years. It's just part of my core. I was the executive director of 5 nonprofits, 2 of which I started from the ground up, and I dealt with education inequities, health inequities, economic inequities, and worked with some of the most marginalized populations, such as formerly incarcerated women and men, severely homeless individuals who are suffering from mental illness, young people transitioning out of the foster home, and women fleeing domestic violence. And what I learned was that every time I did this work, through all my experiences, it was always women that were the backbone of their communities and their families that were leading the change. So it's been an honor and privilege to be the Executive Director of Women's Way for the past 10 years. So I look forward to this conversation.
Thank you, Diane. But can you tell people very briefly about your title, which is Chief Disruptor?
Yes.
Executive.
Yes. So I decided to change my title about a year ago because what we are really doing is trying to disrupt systems that are grounded in exploitation and extraction. And we really need to disrupt these systems to really get at the root causes of all gender inequities. So my job is really to disrupt at multiple levels, which I'll talk more about. But also not just to disrupt, but to build alternative models and strategies that are grounded in equity and inclusion and a dignity and love.
Thank you. Thank you. I love the love part. So we thought to begin with, what we're going to do is we want to set the stage by looking back to the mid-70s. And after all, Women's Way did not emerge, in a vacuum. So, and after we talk about kind of what was going on and, the political, the social, the racial realities of the time, after that, we're going to discuss some of the Women's Way organizations that existed then and the driving forces that led to Women's Way. But first, let's talk a little bit about what was like in the mid-70s. And we're going to start with you, Graham Finney.
Well, the mid-70s in Philadelphia were sort of like the mid-70s are becoming now. There were major changes occurring. that was the eras of Watergate and Nixon and Reagan and a very tough war in Vietnam and even a revolution in Iran. And neighbors here were big fans of Frank Rizzo on one side of the street and Reverend King on the other side of the street. And back then, of course, there were very few, if any, computers or internet. Zooming, obviously, was not even dreamed about. Healthcare was a mess, as it still is. It was either private or very hard to pay for. Blacks, whites, and Puerto Ricans clashed within their own areas. So did emerging gays and lesbians. And a word like trans wasn't even in the vocabulary. Meanwhile, the regional economy was growing very quickly with openings for job opportunities for women of all ages. And most of them had origins in existing businesses and professions. Most all who were hired continued to play roles in those organizations, but a lot of venturesome people went off and opened their own places. Education and connections and personal background all played a part. I was raised by a single mom because my dad died when I was a baby. So I was familiar with working with women in high places. So that on the planning commission that I chaired, we had some very, very important people who became even more so. The Greater Philadelphia movement had to be reformed to deal with desegregated housing and Medicare costs, et cetera. Women were involved in that, but they weren't usually in the top positions in most of these places, like the United Way, for example. So the 70s, to close down, were periods where NGOs, non-governmental organizations, were thriving and multiplying. And now we are at another period when the need has arisen for an establishment of new forms to deal with existing issues that are cropping up in our midst. We have ways to do things now that weren't dreamed of there. AI is something we hadn't even talked about 2 years ago in serious company, and social media is changing the way things go. So the 70s were the start of lots of things, and we've managed lots of things, but now it's a whole new ball game to go forward.
Thank you, Graham. Beverly, Harper?
Yes, I started to think about how I could characterize the 60s and 70s in Philadelphia from the perspective of an African American woman. So I thought I would start with what I think is a metaphor for the sort of race relations back then. I moved into a high-rise apartment building on Rittenhouse Square in 1973. For several years, many times I would get on the elevator and a white person there would ask me who I worked for in the building. In 1973, I had owned my own business for 4 years. I had employed 10 people. I rented an office space in the University City Science Center right near Penn, and in a new building. My revenge for that treatment in the early 70s is that I've lived on Rittenhouse Square for 50 years. In the 1960s and 70s, there was a group called the Black Political Forum. It was a movement to change the political landscape in Philadelphia. The organization was mostly men, John White and others. They were influenced by the voters' rights struggles that was happening in the South, that was continuing to happen in the South. They organized people in neighborhoods in Philadelphia without the benefit of technology. This led to the city's first black mayor being elected, Wilson Good. And it increased the political power that continues today. 4 of the 6 recent mayors have been African Americans. In the 1970s, the dominant non-English language spoken was Spanish. In 1985, the Philadelphia School District lost a court case that which required it to translate materials that were sent home into Spanish. By the 2010s, the district supported students from 130 different countries who at home spoke 100 different languages. Today, you can see what languages are spoken in every school in Philadelphia by going to their website. And finally, the tensions between African American owned and women owned businesses in government contracting surface had been worked on for a couple of decades, but it surfaced in the 1980s as the city debated how and whether to set aside contracts for minority businesses. To gain the support of all of City Council, a compromise was reached. That compromise split a 25% goal into 2 parts, 15% for minorities and 10% for women. The fears of Black businesses that white women would receive much more than 10% was borne out in subsequent years. That's exactly what happened. These cultural issues dominated the African American and Latino communities in Philadelphia during the 70s and 80s, during the 70s and 80s. I think that Women's Way grew up in that environment in Philadelphia.
Thank you, Beverly. I just have a few personal reflections from the 1970s. Women's Way started. I was Planned Parenthood and other family planning organizations lobbyists. We didn't call them lobbyists back then, in New York State. And it's important to remember that while so many of us celebrated Roe v. Wade in 73, that there were already started to be backlash and attacks. And so we needed to be working on that. And then when I left there, I came to go to law school. And in my first week of law school, a male student said to me that I was taking the place of a male student, that I shouldn't be there because after all, as a woman, I probably wasn't going to practice. For those women in the mid 70s, and certainly Letty Thall knew that as the first director of Women Organized Against Rape. But I can remember if somebody who was raped and went into a crowded emergency room back then, that a doctor or somebody on the medical staff would yell, "Where's the rape victim?" And not long after that, talking to a legislator about how rape in marriage should be a crime, and this was one of the more respected ones, he said without missing a beat, "Well, if I can't rape my wife, who can I rape?" I know we all have lots of stories like this, but it kind of want to set the stage of when Women's Way started. We're going to move over now to Letty Thall, who's going to talk about what were the driving forces during that time that led to the creation of Women's Way, and what was its mission? What strategies did you use? What were some of the tensions and so forth? Letty?
Well, I think we need to start with, we were part of a social movement that all of you have alluded to, and we grew out of a fight for women's rights, and all of the individual groups were fighting, and we were looking for empowerment. We saw social problems, and we were going to change the world and the systems that caused those problems. When you mention the example with rape, I think of at one point a wonderful, lovely corporate responsibility person offered to buy televisions for the rape victims who were in the waiting rooms. And I said, hell no, we need to change the system so they don't wait. And I think this poor guy, trying to be very nice and helpful, offering televisions in waiting rooms, but we were about changing the system so people didn't have to wait. And that was part of our whole thought of who we were. And we were concerned about the rape, abortion and health care, divorce, abuse, and lack of economic opportunities and employment discrimination. Nor did we want to follow a model of a male hierarchy. We were coming out of the women's movement, consciousness raising, shared leadership. So we were in groups where we had titles such as co-directors, or I was the organizational administrator of Women Organized Against Rape, because I was not the executive director. We didn't want that kind of system of power. And we rejected having a single boss. So we all followed this model of shared leadership and often rotated leaders, and became kind of group dynamics as well. Many of us were studying that and looking at how we could build together with a shared sense of responsibility. So we came to this concept of building the Philadelphia Women's Coalition, which is what we were called, with these shared values. Some of us were more stricter than others and wanted to make sure we were all co-equal with no hierarchy, but we all needed money. Some of the groups could get foundation support and government grants, but none of us could get corporate support or new deep-pocketed individual donors. So we used the coalition with the seed money from William Penn Foundation to tap the funding sources, which we could not reach individually as groups. So the agencies, 6 of us, met weekly with staff and board members. We each wanted a board member because we wanted the legitimacy that it wasn't just staff acting alone. But since most of the board members were also employed, it ended up that the consistent group that met weekly was staff from the agencies. And we built relationships and bonds among us, making decisions collaboratively. And that trust and shared responsibilities led us to make accommodations for the uniqueness of each of the agencies. Some of the examples were we developed criteria for membership in the coalition, and we decided that it should be locally based. We didn't want any national group because we were all trying to make it on our own. So Girl Scouts or the YW, which had a national kind of helper, we were just locally based, and you had to be in existence for 2 years until we realized one of the agencies had only been in existence for 18 months. So we changed the criteria to be 18 months. And we wanted 1 board member and 1 staff member to represent each agency on our board, on the board of Women's Way. But one agency didn't have a board of directors. They had an advisory board. So we had 2 staff members, so that each agency had 2 members they contributed to the Women's Way board. And we've developed the structure to make sure all decision-making rested with the agencies. All decisions were made equally as a group, usually by consensus, if not by majority. So there could never be more non-agency board members, which we called at-large board members, than agency members. But first we needed to find those people like Graham and Beverly who could lend some credibility to this young group of feminists who some thought were way too radical. So luckily, Lynn A was on the choice board, and she connected us with Ernesta Ballard. So we developed a group, a a list of people, and we had individual meetings with them to share the concept. And then we came back to the group and decided whether these were people we wanted to invite to be board members. So it was all done as a group. And we also used our connections with spouses, such as Fred Ballard from Ballard Spar lent a young associate to help us write our bylaws. He didn't know what to do with us, but Ballard Spar still, I think, continues to offer legal advice to Women's Way, right? Kathy Strauss and some other young lawyers at major firms lobbied their management committees to support us. And then there were some wonderful young women in corporate positions from First Pennsylvania Bank, Scott Paper Company, and Sunoco, who all were incredibly helpful to make connections. And of course, those major corporations no longer exist. So that's kind of how we started. And I don't know if you want to.
That's great. Why don't you mention, Letty, what the six the eight first agencies were that were part of Women's Way?
Okay. Women Organized Against Rape, Choice, Women's Law Project that still is in existence, thank goodness, Elizabeth Blackwell Health Center for Women, Options for Women, it was called Options for Women then, and I am missing somebody from my memory.
Women in Transition.
Women in Transition, thank you very much.
And what about the girls and offenders for the
Pennsylvania Women, Girl, and Offenders were at the very beginning, and Marjorie Velamisi was the executive director, and they did not exist. And I do not know why. I did not know why at the time that all of a sudden they weren't sitting around this folding table, unfolding, on card chairs like the rest of us. But I think they didn't have funding and went out of existence.
Okay, well, thank you. I think that was a wonderful, wonderful introduction to the history. And what we're going to do now is we're going to pivot over to Diane Cornman-Levy, who's going to talk about the current mission and structure, how it's different and similar to what it was years ago.
Yeah, thank you. It's interesting just hearing all you talk, because some of the driving forces that got you to start Women's Way are still pretty similar to today. And I label them as visibility, access to resources, and building collective power. And they are still very much with us today. And so I want to talk a little bit about the challenges that we have today in relation to what was happening in the past. And of course, Graham, you also mentioned it too, that we're really right now, this country is just pushing us back and back because it's grounded so much in misogyny. But one of the things that I want to bring up is legitimacy. That has been a big challenge from the get-go, from when Women's Way started. And what I mean by that is the idea that women and girls deserve targeted philanthropic investment was not widely accepted in the 70s. And now with the fight against DEI and people saying we shouldn't be targeting gender equity, there's this force now saying that we should not be funding these types of organizations. So there was real skepticism about whether this was a core issue, that women's issues were core issues, right? So the leaders that you're listening to made the case over and over again that gender inequity was systemic and worthy of investment. And we're still making that case today. I can't tell you how many times I had to explain to people why you should be investing in women and gender nonconforming folks, why you should be investing in this, because when you invest in women, everything changes. It's a ripple effect. But let me just give you a statistic. So yes, we're making the case why we should be investing in women and girls and gender nonconforming individuals. But even now, only 2% of all charitable giving in the United States goes to organizations focused on women and girls. That means 98% of all philanthropic dollars are not directed toward women and girls. So our mission, which is all about advancing gender equity, and we're all about building collective power to disrupt oppressive systems and build alternative models centered in dignity and equity and love, is in order to do that, we have to raise a lot of money, right? And we have to make the case. So we are constantly working and talking and educating people why it's so important to invest in gender inequities, why it's so important to invest in women and gender nonconforming individuals. Because basically, if you do not, then it's going to have a huge bad economic impact. And when you invest in women and girls, like I said, you invest in families, you invest in communities, you invest in the economy. So we still see this underinvestment in women and girls. And so we still do grant making, and we can talk a little bit more how we do that. But we don't just do grant making. We realize that grant making is not enough. So we actually have 4 key pillars at Women's Way. It's grant making, it's advocacy, it's research, and it's education. Because in order to really get at the root causes of gender inequities, people have to understand how our predominant systems work and how our current capitalistic system works, which is really based on a system of extraction and exploitation. It extracts from many, many people so that a few people at the top of the economic pyramid can make a huge amounts of money. And we're seeing that happening. And we're seeing that when billionaires have that much power, they can start taking over our democracy. So we do grant making. And one of the things we learned about grant making is that, yes, we have to deal with the impact of inequities, which is more dealing with the short-term needs, the immediate urgent needs of women and girls and families. And we do some of that. We also need to invest in movement building, in advocacy, and really invest in organizations that are trying to do systemic change and really addressing the root causes of gender inequities. So we also do grant making to really foster systemic change while also in parallel addressing urgent needs. That's always a challenge, right? But we feel like we need to do both. And the other thing that we feel is very important is we believe that systems arise out of mental models. It arises how we think and understand how things work. And narratives control our mental models. The reason the right-wing conservatives have been so effective, there's many reasons, one is they've been controlling narratives, and you can see they're really escalating. And narratives tell us like why things work, who deserves what, who's not deserving, who's bad, who's harmful, who's a criminal, who's not. So we do a lot of narrative change work to disrupt these harmful narratives, particularly that are targeted at the intersection of gender and race. And so we do a lot of narrative change work. So we actually center the voices of those who are most marginalized, like Black and Brown women, like trans individuals, and elevate their experiences to really try to challenge these harmful narratives and replace them with narratives that are grounded in truth. So we do a lot of narrative change work. We also do a fair amount of research. We know that data is important, right? We know that we have to marry data with stories. We can't just talk about stories. So when I tell people only 2% of philanthropic dollars go to women and children, yet when you invest in women, the impact is huge. People are like blown away. Like, why is this happening? And so we do a fair amount of research, particularly around the root causes of gender economic inequities. And we created something called the Gender Well Framework, which I'm not going to get into because that's a lot right now. But we also started something on the Gender Equity Designer Program. So going back to what I said about mental models, in order to really do equity work well, you have to adopt an equity mindset. It's a very different way of thinking about the world. It's a very different way of funding. So we actually created a Gender Equity Designer Program where we train different stakeholders, nonprofit service providers. We're going to be targeting funders, philanthropies, policymakers. How do you embed gender equity into your mental models, into your workplace culture, into your practices and policies? So that's something we're actually launching this year. We actually launched it this year. So we have 4 things: grant making, education, research, and advocacy. We believe we have to do all these things to really get at the root causes of all gender inequities.
Thank you. Well, you certainly showed how Women's Way has expanded very much from what we focused on, which was fundraising, fundraising, fundraising. I just want to encourage everybody to read comments in the chat. I'm not going to read them, have a look at them. I also want to mention that we're not mentioning, there's some names have been raised. Letty did not, for instance, raise the names of all the founding executive directors or board chairs of the agencies, but that Women's Way in writing a history, I guess Diane will tell us later about what's going on this 50th year. But there is going to be more. There's going to be names of pioneers and leaders and advocates, some of them who are on this call. So it feels a little odd not to mention them, but they will be mentioned as the year goes on.
I
So
can mention some if you want me to.
Well, do you have of the 6, 8, do you have the executive directors of the 6 agencies in front of you? Okay, great.
Okay. Women's Law Project. It was Harriet Katz that was on the board, but Carrie Nicholas very nicely said the managing partner was Barbara Brown, and it was Ann Friedman and Harriet Katz. It's all the shared leadership. So going back to try to figure out who was involved, because we were all recognizing the co-leaders. I was the organizational administrator of WAR. Allison Schwartz was the executive director of Blackwell Health Center. Vicki Kramer and Marcia Kleiman were the co-directors at Options for Women. Women in Transition had Linda Resnick, Lynn McMahon, and Jennifer Fleming. And I'm not sure who was there when or what, but they were all part of us at the table. And Choice had Winnie Schofer.
Yeah, the 3 people you mentioned from Women in Transition, they were all there at the beginning because I met with them when my firm was doing some work for them.
Yeah.
I'm glad that the names came up because they're such a, it feels odd not to mention them. So, and there are many more, some who are on this call. So thank you for doing that. We're going to move over now to some of the milestones of Women's Way, some of the agencies. So we're going to start with the older days. Beverly Harper is going to talk about that, and Letty, and if Bram wants to chime in. And then Diane's going to kind of take it from the early days and talk about what are the milestones for later years and to where we are now. Why don't we start with you, Beverly?
Okay. Well, I don't take it personally that as we talk about the older years, you go to the oldest person on the call. That's all right. I'm proud of it. I'm 84 years old this year, so, and I'm a happy 84-year-old. I believe that the founding members of Women's Way would be thrilled that Women's Way has been able to raise so much money over the years. And since that was one of the main reasons it was started, I remember I co-chaired the first committee that distributed money, and I think it was about $5 that we tried to figure out how to divide that among the 6 organizations. It was a little more than $5, but it was nowhere near what you've achieved today. And I think that's extraordinary, and all of us are very proud of that. One of the other things that I think allows money to be raised, but also is important, is to increase the visibility of Women's Way through its initiatives and things like the conferences. The first conference was the Women's Way dinner in 1978, where Coretta Scott King received the Powerful Voices Award. A little less than 10 years later, the first national conference was in 1987 during the celebration of the country's 200th anniversary. There were 600 people attended from 36 states. They attended to hear people like Gloria Steinem, Janetta Cole, Wilma Mankiller. The theme of the conference was Unfinished Agenda, Women's Future Under the Constitution. And I feel like today we could have the same kind of conference and have the same issues that are being raised today discussed at that conference. Women's Way has demonstrated flexibility to meet the changing needs of women's serving organizations. I was happy as I was doing some initial research for this panel, and I went on the website, and for a number of years, there's a list of organizations that have been funded under different initiatives, and I think that's extraordinary because it's a lot of organizations. And many of them grassroots organizations. Just to mention a couple of them, one is called the Immediate Response Action Fund, which was launched in June of 2017 after my words, disastrous 2016 presidential election. There are 92 organizations have received almost $2 million. I think that's extraordinary, and came right on the heels of that election in October of 2017, the same year. Another major initiative, the Women's Economic Security Initiative was launched in 2017 to address women's economic insecurity. 100 partners joined with Women's Way and had an impact on more than 35,000 women. There's still a lot of work to be done. And Diane has talked about the theoretical base of some of these initiatives, and I think that's great. And the founding members, I think, would feel the same way. The diversity of the board is something to be proud of and a milestone. I think that given I mentioned earlier that the school district has students from 130 different countries speaking 100 different languages. I think we still need some work to do in getting some of these organizations represented on the board, but I think you've done a fabulous job, and the founders would be thrilled that Women's Way has survived these 50 years and has plans for the next 50.
We're not going away.
Right.
Good.
Letty, did you want to add to that? Before you did, since you did mention a bunch of the founding executive directors, I just want to mention that two of the people in the chat, Joanne Fisher was certainly a leader at the very beginning, and Melissa Weiler Gerber has been
Yes.
what? Has
I
been
just said yay.
has been a leader and continues to be and was on this planning committee. Letty, did you want to compliment anything else, supplement what Beverly said before we get to Diane?
As the founder, yes, I'm thrilled. We're back to our roots of looking for social change. One of the tensions early on was, were we service or were we advocating change in terms of member agencies? And I remember having arguments with Lynn A, who said, people want to help people. We want service. But I was very clear that our service was our way of gathering data to then be able to change social systems. So it's wonderful we're going back to our roots. And do you want me to talk a little bit about some of those early challenges, such as with the United Way?
Sure, yes, definitely, because that's really helped put Women's Way on the map. Go ahead.
Right. That was a wonderful public relations exercise, as was that first dinner that Beverly mentioned, and I never can remember whether I was the chair or co-chair, but Joanne Fisher knows that she was the chair or co-chair with me, because we set it up that the chair and co-chair, and then the following year, the co-chair became the chair. So the shared leadership, the passing on of the knowledge base we did with those Lucretia Mott dinners. And that first one with Coretta Scott King was our connection. There was Bill Gray, who in 1978 was running and successfully for Congress for the seat that Dwight Evans is now leaving. And but we got to Bill Gray from Ernesta and from me, who was working for Bill Gray at that time. But any rate, that's the dinner. And then we go to say we have United Way, who's getting all this money. Here we are, Women's Way. We can't raise the same amount of money. So we asked to join United Way. And I still remember we went to a meeting, a huge conference room. I'm not sure where it was, but all the board members were there. And Lynn A, who was then the executive director of Women's Way, and Judy Harris, who was the president of the board, were our spokespeople. And United Way, I remember Herc Porter, and I can't remember who the director, 2 or 3 other men from United Way. And they quite clearly told us that they couldn't accept us as a whole coalition because some of our agencies performed abortion and divorce counseling, and they had a written agreement with the Archdiocese of Philadelphia that they could not fund anything that countered the teachings of the church. And we were all quite aghast. And then it was put in writing, so we could go to the papers and that's when we were able to get a lot of attention and recognition that women's services needed funding.
Okay, excellent, excellent. Diane, we're going to go to you now to take it from there.
Sure. I'm going to go back before I started, and Beverly actually hit some of the ones when I started, but in 1997, Women's Way recognized that they needed to kind of create a pipeline for young women to really fight for gender equity and to get involved in this work. So they started something called the Young Women Initiative that was established in 1997. It was also known as YWI. And it's really it has developed into an opportunity for women in their late 20s and 30s, actually it's now to low 40s, to hone their professional skills, network, and develop and flourish into powerful leaders. Because we are an adaptable organization and we respond to the changing external environment, we are now transitioning YWI, and we'll be talking about this at our 50th anniversary celebration on May 7th, to a philanthropic community. We really want to engage young women to learn how to leverage not just their voices and their votes, but their money, and really start donating and investing in organizations and work that are advancing gender equity. So that's the new transition of YWI that will be happening this year. I also want to mention the Immediate Response Action Fund that Beverly mentioned before. So that was the first program that we started after I became the executive director in January 2017. And I just want to give you some context here. Women's Way went through a really difficult couple of years before I started. And they stopped all programs in 2016 and got rid of the entire staff except Mary Scout, who is the glue of Women's Way. We love Mary Scout. And she was there part-time, and Jessica Muslin, who is amazing, was there on a contractual basis. That was it. And then I came in on January, I think it was 17th, 2017.
Oh, so you were inaugurated the same time as
yes. So
okay.
I lost in as a state, I was running for state rep. So did Hillary Clinton and all these other women, and then Donald Trump won. And I was like, oh, as I say, shit. So I came on board and we're like, what are we going to do? So after the presidential election in 2016, you know that chaos was being created. An unforeseen series of actions and policies by the government took place that was undermining the health and safety of women and girls. So we said, what are we going to do? This was Jessica Muslin and I, and we sat there and we said, we got to do something fast. So we started the Immediate Response Action Fund. So from receiving a completed application to communicating a decision, the IRAF grant review process is completed in 10 business days. It's the fastest grant-making program out there in the entire area. And we've been doing it since 2017. And I know, Letty, you're on the grants committee. So we have a great grants committee. And it's really impacted like over 230,000 individuals. And I can't tell you the demand is ever increasing, obviously, right now. So that was the first program that we launched when I came on board, and it's still very strong thanks to Jessica Muslin, who does a phenomenal job in the grants committee. And then I just want to talk about we talked about the Women's Economic Security Initiative. That was something I really wanted to launch because we really believe that everything stems from the economic system. And if we don't deal with the economic insecurity of women, then all these other things are going to be affected. They're not going to do well. And so in January 2021, after we launched the Women's Economic Security Initiative in 2017, I'm sorry, in 2020, we transitioned it to the Gender Wealth Institute. And the reason we did that is because everyone talks about pay inequities, and it's still there, right? We still have pay inequities. Women still make less than men. And if you do it at the intersection of race and gender, it just gets worse. But we will also look at the gender wealth gap because wealth is a stronger indicator of financial stability, and it's also an indicator of what you can transfer to the next generation. So we transitioned the Women's Economic Security Initiative to the gender wealth gap in 2020. The whole purpose is to close the gender wealth gap by advancing research and practical solutions that build wealth among women and gender nonconforming folks. And Kelly Sheard was hired. And I'm elevating my staff because they're freaking amazing. We're a staff of 7 people. And she just took the lead of this and created so many great things under the Gender Wealth Institute. And one of them is we got a grant from Robert Wood Johnson Foundation in January 2021 to launch a narrative change fellowship program. And this is where we worked with women and gender nonconforming individuals who were really being marginalized by systems of exploitation to empower them to reclaim their voices and use their voices and personal experiences to advocate for change. So we started this in 2021. And I remember this was during COVID. And we were like, oh, how are we going to do this? Well, we did it virtually. That was a whole nother thing we were dealing with. Remember the pandemic, that little thing. And so we've been doing this now for about 5 years, and it's been incredible. All the women that have gone through the Narrative Change Fellowship Program that are now doing advocacy work, they're testifying, they're getting involved in grassroots movements. And so that's part of our narrative change work. And then related to the Gender Wealth Institute, we launched our first Gender Wealth Summit in 2022. So again, we're still doing these kind of summits to bring different stakeholders together to really figure out what are the drivers of the gender wealth gap and how can we work together across sectors. So it's not just nonprofits, it's not just advocates, it's government, it's businesses, and particularly those with lived experiences, co-creating strategy. So we've done that now. We'll be doing our 5th one this year in September. And then I have 2 more. Sorry, hold on. In November of 2024, we received an historic grant of $1.2 million from Vanguard to launch the Gender Economic Equity Program. And that is a program where we are building the capacity of nonprofit organizations to embed gender equity into their workplace culture, their practices, their policy, their programs. And so we're actually focusing on 4 organizations from the care sector because we know how critical the care sector is and what impact it makes on the economic security of women. And finally, in January 2026, we hit a milestone that we have awarded over $2 million of grants to 96 organizations impacting over 480,000 people. So these are through all our grant making programs, and it all started with you 3 folks here and the others. But the reason we were able to do all this is because you built such a strong foundation, and I am forever grateful for that.
Well, that's very inspiring. What is your budget now?
1.8 million.
Okay. And after this 50th anniversary year, hoping it will be even bigger. Let's talk, now that we've heard about some of the things that went on at the beginning, I'm going to ask Diane to talk a little bit about lessons learned over the 50 years and how has Women's Way incorporated those lessons and translated them for your future work?
Yeah, there's so much we've learned. I think one of the biggest takeaways is lasting change requires obviously persistence and evolution. Women's Way, as you've been hearing, has never been static. It's probably been one of our greatest strengths. And what I mean by that, we're always paying attention and responding to the external environment, and hopefully not just responding, but even being proactive. So how do we actually not just respond to things, but how do we create strategies that prevent these things from happening in the first place? And in order to do that, you have to have a learning mindset. So I think all of us, and I know right now our current staff, we learn. There's three things. We learn all the time. So when we try things, we don't know if it's going to be the solution. So first of all, let's be real about, are we designing things and we know the solution? We don't know until we test. We also are willing to take risks.
I'll be right back.
We're willing to be bold. And I think there's a question about trying to be censored with our language. We are not being censored. We are not going to not talk about these inequities. We are not going to stop using language like white supremacy and capitalism and misogyny and racism and all these things that are at the root causes of these inequities. So being bold, being willing to make mistakes but learn from them, and having a learning mindset, and being connected to many, many partners, listening to them. As a leader, I think one of the most important roles I take is listening to others. I don't know a lot of stuff. I don't. I will listen to our partners. I will listen to policymakers. I'll listen to people with lived experiences. We need to listen and then work together to co-create strategies. That's a very important lesson learned. And we need to continue to center those most marginalized at the table to inform what do we do? Where should we allocate resources? What are the strategies that we should be designing? So who's at the table matters. So I think, learning that, centering those who are most exploited. And I want to go back to the idea that when Women's Way started, it was very much about women, but how did we define women? And it was predominantly cis, right, white women. And now it's like, when we talk about who we serve, and this has been an ongoing internal challenge and really important challenge. Who do we serve? Is it just cis white women? No. It is women, it's cis women, it's trans, it's gender nonconforming, it's gender non-binary. We have to be very clear that we are serving many different populations, because women is not a monolithic group. So I think that's something we learned, that we take an intersectional approach. And basically intersectionality is that based on your social identities, you're going to experience oppression and exploitation in different ways and then more severely. And I think also what we learned is that philanthropy alone is not enough, right? Philanthropy is important, but it's also not, we cannot just do philanthropy to address the impact of inequities. We have to invest in things that are addressing the root causes, like movement building and advocacy. And I also think that the third thing that's really important is data is a powerful tool for change. And so I think, as we have more data, and we have more data because we have elevated these issues like sexual harassment and things like that. And we have more data to share, like how much money is going to women and girls. We need to marry that data with stories to mobilize people and build public will. And finally, progress is not linear. There are moments of advancement and there's moments of backlash, right? And we've been seeing this over the history of this country. And one of the lessons is the importance of staying grounded in your values while being adaptable in strategy. We got to stay certain. So when people are telling me, Diane, you can't use those words, you got to change your strategy, you got to change your mission, I'm like, no, we're going to stay grounded in our values and in our principles, but we will be adaptable in our strategy. So those are some of the lessons.
Letty, did anybody want to add anything about lessons? Yeah. Okay, well, go ahead, Letty, did you want to?
I just think Diane
Okay.
summarized it
Okay.
wonderfully, and you're a terrific leader. I mean, that's what we need, is to recognize we need, in our day, we called it social change, but not accept the status quo.
That's kind of a little related to, Graham, were you going to say something? No.
Oh, no.
This probably goes to you, Letty. So Flora Wolf mentions, I know you raised this before, but maybe we should talk a little bit about it because it's relevant for the evolution of what Women's Way, of Women's Way. And she asked, can you talk more about the overlap, conflict of service and advocacy, and how does that reflect in participation? Do you want to do that one?
I'll try, because part of it was there were the agencies, and then we created an additional entity that grew into Women's Way to do the fundraising. So the agencies provided service to women, but that service to women was because nobody else was providing, nobody else was checking whether what was going on. Actually, and it happened with the rape kits. We were so successful, we thought to get rape kits into hospitals, and then nobody was processing them. So Women's Law Project picked that up recently. But we need the knowledge of the service, but we need to collect that data to begin to look at how that impacts the systems. So I don't see a conflict. I see it needing to be complementary. And that's what we need to recognize. And we used Women's Way to go be the nice to collect the money while we could stand on the sidelines and tell the people in charge they were doing it wrong or they needed to do it in a different way.
It was also somewhat of a reaction to what funders would fund, because funders will often fund more service,
Yes.
And not as much advocacy. And those of us who started it were really cared about kind of changing the world, and yet that wasn't as fundable. I'm going to move us on to with everything that's going on in the world today. What gives you hope? And then I'm going to ask you after that is whether you suggest a call to action, either for all of us, society, or recommendations for Women's Way. So hope. You want to start with you, Beverly, and then Graham?
Sure. I'm an optimist. So I always think that things can and will get better. So I picked two things that I think are particularly, or could be particularly relevant to Women's Way. And that is the speed at which we can communicate today across all socioeconomic, geographic, and cultures. And I think that some of the things that have happened to Women's Way over the, I'll say the first 30 years, we didn't have that benefit. And still the organization progressed and got better. So I think that part of what we have to do is to find ways to capture those first 30 years, because they were the critical years that laid the foundation. And we heard a lot about it today. I appreciate that. And then the second thing that gives me hope is the advances in medicine and medical devices. I think that, women have been left out of clinical trials and things like that. And part of the advocacy that we have to do going forward is to make sure that we get included. And these medical advances are happening all over the world in both the public and the private sector. And no matter what this country does to stop funding, it is not going to stop those advances. So those are my two things.
Good. Graham? Thank you, Beverly.
Well, I think something should get greater attention, and that is this is the old man here talking. But I think so many of the scary issues that we in this country are facing now uh, are being equally faced by men in the changing roles that are occurring in our politics, etc. So I think in addressing all of these incredible ventures that Women's Way has been involved in, that the need to help educate the men in the process of increasing gender equity is something that should be on the table as we see more interactions about really extraordinarily basic parts of our society going through wrenching changes in a world of social media, in a world of AI. So, some attention to not only advance the women's part of gender, but helping to illustrate those issues in terms that men can better understand is probably a part of the game plan going forward.
Excellent point. Well said. Letty, did you want to, what do you?
Yeah.
hopeful
What gives
about?
me hope is some of the young women involved in Women's Way, or younger than I women involved in Women's Way, for the next generation, and the amount, the political landscape of women in Harrisburg, and some of our representation in Congress, but in particular, the fact that we've got an incredible number of women, not just from the Philadelphia area, representing, the way I look at it, representing me in Harrisburg is just marvelous.
And actually, I know Women's Way is nonpartisan, but there are a lot of really good people, good women running for state house and state house and state senate to be on the
And-
lookout for,
Yes.
as well as Congress.
Yes. And to know that they're there. And I go back from the 60s and 70s, what we said was the personal is political.
Diane, do you want to weigh in on what gives you
Yes.
hope?
I think it's the same thing that has sustained Women's Way for 50 years, people coming together to demand and build something better. Even in the face of real challenges, I see extraordinary leadership emerging, especially from women and gender nonconforming people, young people, those who have been historically pushed from the margins. They're not waiting for permission. They're organizing, innovating, and redefining what leadership looks like. And to Beverly's point, they're using social media, like the Me Too movement, Black Lives Matter. I mean, those things have created so much change. And I think younger people are understanding that they have so many more tools to build collective voices, to build collective power, to mobilize people. I also find hope that we're having more honest conversations than ever before about power, about equity, about racism, about white supremacy. When I started at Women's Way, I started talking about white supremacy and people were like, what are you talking about, Diane? Like, no. And now it's like part of these conversations. We're having real conversations about who has access to resources and who doesn't. And that awareness matters because you can't change what you won't name and what you don't see. So I think just a huge, I think particularly I would say this to white people, they thought that racism didn't exist anymore. I don't know what they're thinking. It's like, wake up. Like it's such a part of every part of our society, but now people are willing to talk about it. And I'm also frankly hopeful because of community. Frankly, like spaces like this, like we're having these amazing conversations around really hard topics, and people are willing to show up, they're willing to engage and invest in change. And I have to tell you, every week I have people saying, Diane, how can I help? What can I do? I'm angry. How do I channel my anger? Which we're going to go to the next thing, call to action. But there are many ways to do that. So I have a lot of hope. I wouldn't do this work unless I had hope.
I'm glad I asked. I think hope is really important for everything. And I don't think anybody would have been involved at the beginning if we didn't hope, people didn't hope that there was a way to make things better. So let's talk about a call to action. And that can be for Women's Way, or it can be really more generally in terms of society. Things like people showing up at the No Kings March this Saturday, and bringing everybody they know and voting and so forth. But who wants to go first on a call to action?
I will.
Okay.
I have a couple of things. One, I think it's critical that we understand the speed of technology. And just a couple of things. It took the cell phone 17 years to reach broad adoption, meaning that more than 50% of the people had access to it. The smartphone took 5 years. Artificial intelligence took 2 years. I was on Tuesday, I saw a 2 foot by 3 foot robot. I don't even know what to say, whether it was walking or rolling, the 1300 block of Walnut Street in Center City, Philadelphia at rush hour. It waited 3 feet from the curb before it crossed Broad Street. People marveled at it, took photos. No one touched it. No one knew what it was doing. Imagine that by the hundreds. Understand the speed of political and social change. Without public discussion or congressional oversight, we lost part of the White House and the Kennedy Center name in less than a year. I think one of the recommendation for Women's Way is to include business ownership as an economic tool for security and wealth, including and maybe even emphasizing professional services, because they can scale up faster than an individual store. Not that individual stores are not important, they are, but I don't think we do enough with professional services. And ask people for money. I don't think I've ever gotten a solicitation from Women's Way, except Myra Brown asked me to support something she was doing, which I did instantly. Ask me for money.
Okay.
That's an opening. Before we go on to Graham, I want to encourage people who are listening here to put in the chat what you think of as a call to action, whether it's generally or for Women's Way. And Women's Way we'll collect these as the year progresses, and I hope that over time we'll also hear from younger people, more younger people about that. Graham, what about your call to action?
Well, again, I think that it has to be sensitive to all these fast-breaking issues that are stemming from the technological revolution that we're in the middle of, that there are ways that Women's Way as an organization can ask tough questions and raise key issues with powerful people who very often work from the money angle, but not from the family building angle. I think women's role in the next years will get even more diverse, not only as seen now in political circles in places like Harrisburg, but I would hope that there would be enterprising young people looking at state government as well as a place to spend more time. the technological
Mhm.
social media thing, I think, is very, very key in terms of organizing effective ways for gender equity to be improved.
Thank you. Letty and Diane, and I'm going to ask you to speed up. Look, I want to be able to get to some questions from the audience.
Mine is to use your voice, whether you're out on the street, writing letters instead of responding to emails, because different ways of getting attention and communicating, and to use your checkbook. I always go back to a paraphrase from Gloria Steinem when she was one of the Lucretia Mott awardees. She said, "Your values are in your checkbook." For those of us who can have bank accounts, see where the money goes and start sending it to some causes such as Women's Way.
They're
Wonderful.
also in your credit cards.
Right, right.
Thank you, Graham.
Diane, did you want to add anything that you haven't already said?
Yeah, all good. I'm going to target this to two groups. If you're a funder, fund more, faster, and bolder.
Mhm.
And if you're a leader or a position of power, use your platform to open doors for others. I'm just going to leave it at that.
Excellent, excellent. Here's a question. I'm often told to change our language to make us marketable to funders long term. Long term, I don't think that is a benefit to us as we plan to continue work providing gender affirming services. Are the short term gains worth the change in mission language? That probably goes to Diane.
Yeah, I said before, great question, because this is coming up a lot,
Right, it's a good question.
that people are like, oh, we're not supposed to be using words like gender equity or all the, DEI. And I will say this, I don't think we should be censored, because then we're losing. How I approach working with funders is it's a way to educate and have a conversation. Not all funders are going to listen to you. That's okay. There are some that are willing to listen and say, okay, let's talk about this. Let's have these real conversations and start building real relationships with funders. Funders don't need to be transactional partners. They need to actually be partners. And so one of the things we want to do at Women's Way is to get a group of funders to get involved in our gender equity designer program, because they really need to work on adopting an equity mindset, and with that, it's going to change how we do funding. So my answer is no, we need to keep having these honest conversations and not talk around the core issues, but talk directly at it about the issues. And again, some will go away, and some will stay, and some will learn. And so I think it's really trying to shift how we look at funders, our relationship with them. It's like, how do we become real partners where we're learning together and working together, and not just like this power dynamic, like I got the money and you're begging from me. And I know that's a real power dynamic, but we're working to shift that power dynamic, that the real power and decision making should be from the people that are being exploited and extracted and doing the work on the frontline workers, and they should be informing funders where resources should go, how much money should go out there. So that was a long answer, but
No, good. Thank you for the excellent question and an inspiring response. I'm glad this next question has come up, and is how does Women's Way center lesbian experiences, and particularly lesbians of color? How has that changed over time, and how is this important to moving forward? And I'm glad that Ellie DeLappy asked us. She's been a leader in this area. Who wants to talk about that?
Letty, do you want to say something?
Well, I'm just trying to think back. We recognized, but I'm not sure anybody really talked about it.
So it's a great question, because when I talked about intersectionality and how we have to look at populations that are being most exploited by our current capitalistic system, is certainly at the intersection of gender, race, and sexual orientation. And how are we doing that? Well, one, we're directing funds directly to organizations that support the LGBTQI plus community and trans community. So and one way we're doing that is the Gender Justice Fund has a Trans Resilience Fund, and they have very strong relationships with that population. They already have a grant making program. So we just gave money to them and said, take this money and invest in those organizations. So it's being more intentional about where our resources go and what organizations are we supporting and who is being most exploited and marginalized. So that's being very intentional about where our money goes. I think another thing we need to work more on is having those people represented on our board. We have diversity, but we're still not strong with our diversity around LGBTQ, with trans. So, I mean, that we need to increase our diversity in that because they need to have decision-making power in our organization. We are doing a lot around advocacy. By the way, we just started an advocacy community and we love people to join it. But we're really getting groups representative from those populations. And also we need to be more visible at their events. So we're being very intentional of, is there an event being put on by the LGBTQ population? What is that event? Who's going to be there? We need to build relationships with members of those communities. So as a staff, we're all looking at those opportunities to be physically and visibly out there in their spaces, learning with them. So we have a better relationship with them. We can better determine how and best to distribute our resources.
I also think,
Go ahead.
I just want to say, as the Immediate Response Fund has funded some groups of
Yes.
LGBTQ and some trans, that there have been, you're collecting people asking for money, that I'm aware of
Yes.
receiving
Yes.
these applications.
Yeah, and again, your finances and where your dollars go is a reflection of your values and priorities. So that's why we're being you have to be intentional of like so much money goes to this population.
Thank you. It's 5:25 already. Before we do our closing comments, is there anything that any of you wanted to raise that we didn't already raise? Okay, good. Diane, I know that you wanted to, I think it's important for you to have some time talking a little bit about the 50th anniversary year and what else is lined up. How can people participate? How can they contribute, and in not only financially but in other ways?
So this is again our first official kind of event of our 50th year. Our next big event is our 50th anniversary celebration, which is on May 7th at the Crystal Tea Room from 5 to 8:30 p.m. And it's our large annual fundraiser, and it's a great event because there's like 500 people there that are just from all walks of life that all care about these issues. It's a great way to meet new people, to maybe reunite with other people. And this year we're honoring 3 congresswomen from Pennsylvania, Representatives Dean, Scanlon, and Houlihan. We haven't heard back from Summerlee yet, but we're very excited about honoring them because they are really women trailblazers. And we're also honoring Mary Scout with the Mary Scout Legacy Award. We created a new award in her honor because so we're asking people to donate in her honor, and you can do that. I think there's yes. I think Misha put the website there at womensway.org. Yeah, Celebrate 50. So you can actually go there to that website and purchase tickets. If you can't attend, you can make a donation because, like you said, and you heard Letty, we need money. And if you know Mary Scout, who we all love, you can make a donation in her honor, which would be so awesome. And then, so that's the next big event. We're going to have an event probably in June where we're going to be elevating the work of more younger women and girls. The details has yet to be determined. And then in September, we're going to have our 5th annual Gender Well Summit. We'll give you more information about that. That's a wonderful way to come together and have these engaging conversations about how are we addressing some of the core drivers of gender inequity, but that usually takes place in September. We'll have more information about that. And then we'll have our annual book prize, which actually was another milestone that was started many years ago, that we honor female or gender nonconforming authors. So we'll have more about that. That usually takes place in October. So just continue to follow us on our website because we'll have updated events for you to participate in.
And I assume that anybody who has participated in this, you will do a follow-up to everybody here about some of the things that you've said and what's on the horizon.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And yes, and this is also recorded. So if you want to share this, please share this with other people. This will be on our website. It'll be available for you to watch and others to watch anytime. I saw that Misha Rodriguez, who's the director of communications at Women's Way, put up the website to go right to our 50th anniversary fund. So we also have a 50th anniversary fund, which is actually money raised for the YWI Young Women's Initiative. And all that money is going to go to grants that are going to help organizations that are really working with young women and girls. So there's many ways to support the work we do. And always come, and in the advocacy community, I don't know if we have a link for that or probably not, but we can send more information about that.
Yes.
That's a growing community of people coming together who want to work together on these issues that are affecting women and gender nonconforming individuals.
Well, on behalf of Women's Way, I'd like to thank everybody who is tuned into this and who will see it as a recording. Beverly, Harper, Graham, Finney, Letty, Thall, and Diane Cornman-Levy. I think you have showed us that you were the right person for the right time to move us forward. Maybe not for another 50 years, but at least for the near future. So thank you all very much.